The orc mother came to his door in the biting autumn rain, with nothing left but her 2 children and the raw, red welts where the chains had been. She came to his door expecting the end of a long and terrible road, and found instead the quiet man who would help her build a new one. She stood on the threshold of the small, isolated cabin, the forest dark and dripping behind her. For a full minute, she simply swayed, held upright by a will that was more memory than present fact. Her son, no more than 10, stood ramrod straight beside her, a small, fierce protector with his mother's wary eyes. Her daughter, half his age, was a dead weight in her arms, asleep and mercifully unaware. The rain plastered gauze's thin tunic to her gaunt frame, tracing the hard lines of bone beneath her grey-green skin. One of her tusks, the left one, was broken short, a jagged white line against the weary grey of her lips. She raised a hand, heavy as a stone, and knocked once. A soft, desperate sound, almost lost in the drumming of the rain on the roof. She waited. She heard the scrape of a chair inside, then the slow, heavy tread of boots on wood. When the door opened, the man who stood there was not what she expected. He was human, yes, but there was no immediate sneer, no hand reaching for a weapon. He was just a man, his face lined with a quiet sorrow, his eyes holding the flat, still surface of a frozen lake. He looked at her, then at the boy, then at the sleeping girl in her arms. He took in the raw skin of her wrists, the exhaustion that was pulling her down into the mud. He said nothing. Gauze's throat was tight. Words were dangerous. Apologies were a currency she had paid in for years, and they had bought her nothing. Still, the habit was there. "Forgive the intrusion," she began, her voice a low rasp. "We saw the smoke, just for the children. Shelter from the rain." The man's gaze did not change. His name was Elias, though she did not know that. He had lived in this cabin alone for 3 years, since the winter fever had taken his wife, Alara. He chopped wood, he set snares, he kept the silence. The world had shrunk to the walls of this house, and the memory of a woman's laughter that no longer echoed in them. He looked at the 3 figures shivering on his porch, and a feeling he hadn't felt in a long time stirred within him. Not pity, something quieter, a simple recognition of need. By the way, wherever in the world you're listening from right now, drop it in the comments. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. Okay, where were we? He stepped back from the door, a silent invitation. It was more than she had dared to hope for. Gorza hesitated, her mind racing, searching for the trick, the price that would be exacted later. There was always a price. But the cold was seeping into her daughter's small body, and the boy was trembling, though he tried to hide it. She took a shuffling step forward, across the threshold, and into the warmth. The cabin was 1 room, clean and spare. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a low fire crackling within it, casting dancing shadows. The air smelled of wood smoke pine resin, and something else. The faint, dusty scent of a place where life had been held in suspension. On the mantel above the fire sat a single object that seemed out of place in the rustic simplicity of the room. A tin lantern, punched with an intricate pattern of stars and crescent moons. It was beautiful, but it was unlit. Dust lay thick on its surface. Elias closed the door, shutting out the storm. The sound was so final. He gestured toward the fire. "Sit," he said. His voice was like his face, rough but not unkind. Gorza did as she was told, sinking onto the worn rug before the hearth with a groan of relief she could not suppress. She gently laid her daughter Lynn down, pulling the child's damp tunic away from her skin. Her son Cale remained standing, positioning himself between his family and the man, his small jaw set. Elias ignored the boy's hostile posture. He moved to the iron pot hanging over the fire, lifted the lid. The savoury smell of rabbit stew filled the small space. Gorza's stomach clenched with a painful, violent hunger. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. The children had shared the last of the stale bread that morning. Elias ladled a portion of the stew into a single wooden bowl, added a thick slice of dark bread beside it, and set it on the floor near her. Just one bowl. She stared at it. It was a test, she thought, a cruel kindness. He would watch her eat while her children starved. This was the way of things. She looked up at him, her eyes clouded with suspicion and a deep, bottomless weariness. He met her gaze, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something in his own. Understanding, perhaps. He turned away without a word and went to a large wooden chest against the far wall. He pulled out 2 thick woolen blankets, worn but clean. He laid them on the floorboards, a good distance from the fire, but well within its circle of warmth. "For the children," he said, his back to her. Then he went to his own cot in the corner, sat down, and began mending a snare with methodical, practiced movements, his attention seemingly fixed on his work. He did not watch her. Gorza looked at the bowl of stew, at her sleeping daughter, her fierce son. Cale's eyes were locked on the food, his hunger a palpable thing in the quiet room. She took the bowl, picked up the spoon, and held it out to him. "You first," she whispered. The boy shook his head stubbornly. "No, you." "Cale." Her voice was firm, but it was a strain. He did not yield. He was his father's son in that, proud and unbending. She saw the conflict in his face, the war between duty and desperation. She broke off a piece of the bread, dipped it into the thick gravy, and held it to his lips. This time he could not refuse. He took it, chewing slowly, his eyes never leaving the man in the corner. Gorza then woke Lynn, whose small, sleepy protests turned into whimpers of need at the smell of the food. Gorza fed her daughter small spoonfuls of the stew, watching as a little colour returned to the girl's pale cheeks. Only when both children had eaten their fill, sharing the single portion until the bowl was wiped clean with the last of the bread, did Gorza allow herself to lick the spoon. It tasted of salt and herbs and a safety she couldn't yet bring herself to believe in. She wrapped her children in the blankets, their small bodies finally warm, and sat between them, her back against the rough-hewn wall, watching the fire and the silent man, waiting for the dawn. She did not sleep. She had forgotten how. The next morning the storm had passed. A pale, watery sunlight filtered through the cabin's single window. Gorza awoke from a light, fitful doze to the sound of the man Elias moving about. He was already dressed, stoking the fire back to life. Her children were still asleep, nestled together under the wool. She sat up, her body aching with 1,000 small pains. The first thought in her mind was debt. She had taken shelter, warmth, food. A debt had been incurred. She had to work it off before they were cast out. She got to her feet, moving stiffly, and went to the door. Outside, the air was cold and clean. A stack of uncut logs lay beside the cabin, haphazard and sprawling. An axe was wedged in a nearby stump. Without a word, she picked it up. The handle was smooth, worn to the shape of a man's grip. It felt solid in her hands. She had done this work before. In the labour camp run by Warden Valerius, this was women's work, just as much as men's. She selected a log, set it on the stump, and swung. The axe bit deep, the clean sound echoing in the morning stillness. She worked methodically, her movements economical and powerful. She did not split the logs for burning yet. First, she organized. She sorted the wood by size and type, creating neat, interlocking stacks against the cabin wall, building a structure that would shed water and allow the air to circulate. It was mindless work, and her mind was grateful for it. It was honest work, and her soul craved that. Elias came out and stood on the porch, a tin cup of steaming chicory in his hand. He watched her for a long time. He saw the efficiency in her movements, the deep-seated knowledge of the wood. He saw the way she tested the grain of each log before placing it. This was not the clumsy effort of a desperate refugee. This was the work of someone who understood labour. He noted the way she favoured her right side, the slight stiffness in her left shoulder. He noted the grim set of her jaw, a mask of concentration that hid whatever turmoil lay beneath. When Cale and Lynn emerged from the cabin, blinking in the morning light, they saw their mother working and the man watching. Cale immediately tensed, his hand balling into a small fist. Lynn, however, simply stared at the man with wide, curious eyes. Elias lowered his gaze from Gorza to the children. He went back inside. A moment later he returned and set 3 wooden bowls on the top step of the porch. Each held a portion of hot oat porridge with a drizzle of honey on top. He did not say a word. He just left them there and walked away toward the forest, his own axe slung over his shoulder. Gorza stopped her work, her breath catching in her throat. 3 bowls, not 1, 3. Cale stared at the food, then at the man's retreating back, his suspicion warring with his hunger. Gorza walked slowly to the porch and sat down on the steps. She picked up a bowl and handed it to her son. She gave the second to Lynn, who was already reaching for it with a sleepy smile. She took the third for herself. They ate in silence, the warm, sweet porridge a revelation. It was the first time in a very long time that she had eaten a meal that was not a leftover, a scrap, or a reluctant charity. It was an offering, a wage paid in advance. When she finished, she took the empty bowls inside. The cabin was empty, but a pot of water was warming by the fire. She washed the bowls in the stew pot from the night before, drying them with a clean rag she found hanging by the hearth. She looked around the small space. It was a man's home, functional and without adornment, save for the lantern on the mantel. She ran a finger over its dusty surface, tracing the delicate stars. It felt like a holy object, something left behind by a ghost. She felt a pang of something akin to trespass and pulled her hand back. Her place was not here, among memories that were not hers. Her place was outside, with the woodpile. She worked for the rest of the day. She chopped, she stacked, she sorted. She swept the porch clean of bark and wood chips. By the time Elias returned at dusk, a brace of squirrels hanging from his belt, the chaotic woodpile had been transformed into a fortress of winter fuel, neat and formidable. He stopped and looked at it, his eyes taking in the sheer volume of her labor. He looked at her, standing beside her work, her face smudged with dirt, her hands raw. "That's good work," he said. The words were plain, unadorned, a simple statement of fact. Gorza flinched, expecting a qualifier, a but, an "it's not enough." When none came, she looked up at him, and for the first time since she had arrived, a genuine, if fleeting, smile touched her lips. It was a small, hesitant thing, like a winter flower pushing through frozen ground, but it was there. "It is honest work," she replied, her voice low. That night he cooked the squirrels, and they shared the meal from 4 bowls. No one spoke of payment or of leaving. The arrangement settled into place without discussion. The wee stones settle into the bed of a river. A quiet exchange. Her labour for his shelter. It was a bargain she understood. It was the gentleness that she did not. Weeks turned into a month. A routine, unspoken and unbidden, began to weave itself around the 4 of them. Gorza took over the management of the household with a quiet efficiency that slowly began to warm the cold corners of the cabin. She cooked and mended, her stitches small and neat, repairing the worn places in Elias's shirts. She learned the rhythms of his days, his early departure into the woods, his return at dusk. She never asked where he went or what he did. She simply ensured there was hot water for him to wash and a warm meal waiting. The children, too, found their place. Cale, after days of silent observation, finally approached Elias as he was cleaning his snares. "Show me," the boy demanded, his voice tight with a mixture of challenge and curiosity. Elias looked at the boy's serious face, then nodded. He showed Cale how to find a rabbit run, how to tie the slip knot that would hold fast, how to scent the trap with pine needles to mask the smell of man and oak. He was a patient teacher, his large calloused hands moving with a slow, deliberate grace. Cale was a quick study. He watched everything, absorbed every detail. A silent bond began to form between them, built on the shared language of the forest. Lynn, in her own way, began to fill the cabin's deep silence. She had Ilara's temperament, Elias realized one day with a jolt that was both painful and sweet. She was not afraid of the quiet. She would sit by the fire for hours, humming tuneless songs to a doll she had fashioned from a corn husk and scraps of yarn. She would follow Elias around the cabin as he did his chores, a small, chattering shadow. One afternoon, she presented him with a fistful of late-blooming mountain asters. their purple petals a shock of colour against his worn leather tunic. He stood there, holding the fragile flowers in his rough hand, at a complete loss. He hadn't been given a flower in 3 years. He didn't have a vase. He ended up putting them in a spare tin cup on the windowsill, where they caught the afternoon light. The sight of them there, so bright and alive in the muted browns and greys of his home, felt like a window opening in a sealed room. Gorza watched these small interactions with a guarded heart. She saw the way Elias's shoulders had lost some of their rigid set. She saw the way Cale's suspicion was slowly being replaced by a grudging respect. She saw the easy affection Lynn offered and the clumsy, gentle way Elias received it. A part of her felt a terror she could not name. This felt too much like a home. It felt like something that could be taken away. The muscle of her hope had been torn so many times, she was afraid to use it again. One evening, a cold wind rattled the shutters, a promise of the coming winter. The 4 of them sat around the hearth. The children were asleep, Cale on his pallet, and Lynn curled up with her head in Gorza's lap. The firelight flickered across Elias's face, softening its harsh lines. The silence between them was comfortable now, a shared space rather than an empty one. He was carving a piece of wood, the knife moving with practiced ease, shaving off thin curls that fell to the floor. "You never sing to her," he said, his voice quiet. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. Gorza's hand, which had been stroking Lynn's hair, stilled. She looked down at her daughter's sleeping face. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't." He didn't press. He just kept carving, the rhythmic scrape of the blade the only sound for a long time. Gorza felt the question hanging in the air between them, and with it the weight of all the things she had never said. She had given him her labour, her skills. She had never given him her story. He had never asked for it. Perhaps that was why, in the warm, safe quiet of that cabin, she finally found the courage to offer it. "There was a song," she began, her gaze fixed on the flames. "An old lullaby in the old tongue. My mother sang it to me. I sang it to Cale when he was a baby. I was singing it to Lynn the night they came." Elias stopped carving. He set the piece of wood and the knife down on the hearth and gave her his full attention. "My mate, Cale's father, died in the mines, a collapse. Warden Valerius owned the mine. He owned the contracts. When a worker died, his debt passed to his family. We became his property in all but name. He moved us from the miners' camp to his own estate. He liked to present himself as a benevolent man, a patron to the less fortunate races." A bitter smile touched her lips. "He was fond of public charity. He would hold feasts and make a show of giving the orc families scraps from his table, as if we were dogs he was training." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "He hated the song. He said it was a savage sound, uncivilized. One night, Lynn was crying. She had a fever. I was walking with her in the courtyard of the barracks, singing the lullaby to soothe her. Valerius was entertaining guests. He came out onto his balcony. He told me to be silent. My child was crying, I tried to explain. He didn't care. He said the noise was upsetting his guests." Her voice grew thinner, stretched taut with the memory. "He had his guards bring me to the centre of the courtyard. He made me kneel. He said that if I insisted on making animal noises, he would treat me like an animal. He put a collar on me and a chain, and he left me there all night in the cold while my daughter cried for me in the barracks. Kale tried to get to me. They beat him for it. She looked up from the fire and met Elias's eyes. Her own were dry. The tears burned out of her long ago. I never sang it again. I lost my voice that night. He took it, along with everything else. She told him about the years that followed, the slow, grinding erosion of her spirit, the constant, casual cruelties dressed up as discipline, the way Valerius used the town's prejudice against orcs as a weapon, isolating her, making sure no one would listen if she cried for help. She told him about the escape, how she'd stolen a file from the blacksmith shop, how she'd worked for weeks in the dead of night to saw through the links of the chains that bound the barracks doors, how she'd fled into the forest with her children and the clothes on their backs, running until her lungs burned and her feet bled. Elias listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply sat there, a block of silent, unwavering stillness, and heard her. He took in every word of her pain and her resilience, and he held it. When she finally fell silent, the story told. A great, shuddering sigh escaped her. It was the sound of a burden being set down for the first time. He reached over and picked up the piece of wood he had been carving. He had been shaping it into a small, clumsy-looking bird. He held it out to her. It was rough, unfinished, but it was recognizable. For the girl, he said gruffly, when she wakes. It was not a promise to fix what was broken. It was not a vow of vengeance. It was a small, solid thing, a piece of wood shaped into a gift. It was his way of saying, I see you. I hear you. You are here now. Gorza took it, her fingers closing around the wood. It was still warm from his hands. And in that moment, she felt the first tentative stirring of a root taking hold in the hard, barren soil of her heart. A heart, she was beginning to learn, did not heal by forgetting what it had lost, but by growing large enough to hold the memory and the new life beside it. The peace of their small, found world was shattered 2 weeks later. Elias had gone into the nearby town of Stonefall for supplies, a trip he made only a few times a year. He returned just after noon, his face grim, the usual sacks of flour and salt unloaded from his mule with a tense, hurried energy. Gorza knew immediately that something was wrong. He didn't speak at first. He put the supplies away, his movements clipped and precise. Kale, who had been helping him, watched his face, his own expression growing anxious. Finally, Elias turned to Gorza. He's here, he said, the words falling like stones into the quiet cabin. Gorza didn't have to ask who. A cold dread, chillingly familiar, washed over her, making her feel weak and exposed, even here by her own hearth. In Stonefall, she whispered. Elias nodded. Warden Valerius. He arrived this morning in a fancy carriage with 2 guards. He's staying at the inn. He's been asking questions about a runaway ward, an orc female with 2 children. The air left Gorsa's lungs. She stumbled back a step, her hand flying to her throat. The cabin, which had become her sanctuary, suddenly felt like a trap. The forest outside, her path to freedom, now seemed like an open door for him to walk through. He knows I'm here? Not yet, Elias said, but he will. A man like that, in a town this small, secrets don't keep. He's telling everyone he's here to reclaim his legal property. He has documents, contracts. Gorsa sank onto a stool, her head in her hands. Documents, contracts, the papers that had signed her life away. She could already hear Valerius's voice, smooth and reasonable, painting her as a simple, confused creature who had wandered off, a danger to herself and her own children. He would be so convincing. He would smile his charming smile, and the townsfolk, who already looked at orcs with suspicion, would nod and agree. They would see his fine clothes, hear his educated words, and they would see her own rough appearance, and they would believe him. "We have to run," she said, her voice choked with panic. "Now, before he finds us." "No," Elias said. His voice was quiet, but it held a certainty that cut through her fear. "There's no outrunning a man like that. He has money, influence. He'd hire trackers. He would hunt you down. Running is what he expects." "Then what do we do?" she cried, her composure finally breaking. "Let him take us back? Let him put chains on me again, on my children?" The thought was so horrific, it stole her breath. Elias came and stood before her. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a shield. "You are not his property, Gorsa. You are a free woman. You did your work. You paid your debt. Cruelty voids a contract." "Who will believe that?" she shot back, her voice raw with despair. "Who in that town will take the word of an orc over a rich human warden?" "I will," he said simply. "And that's a start." He looked at Cale, who was standing frozen by the door, his face pale with terror. "Cale, fetch more water from the creek. Lynn, help your brother. Stay close to the cabin." He was giving them a task, moving them out of the circle of fear. The children, accustomed to obeying, nodded and scurried out. When they were alone, Elias spoke again. "Valerius thrives on an audience. He won't come crashing through the woods, that's not his style. He'll use their laws, their counsel. He'll try to turn the town against you publicly, and that is where we will face him." His calm was a lifeline. Gorsa clung to it, trying to draw strength from his resolve. "How?" "Mistress Albright," he said. "She's the town elder. She's a hard woman, but she is fair. She values honesty above all else. My word has weight with her. Not much, but some. I will go and speak with her. I will tell her you are here, under my protection. I will tell her you are a good worker and a good mother." "He will have papers, Elias, stamped and sealed." "Papers can lie," Elias said, his gaze steady. the marks on your wrists do not." He left an hour later, heading back down the path to Stonefall. Gorza watched him go, a storm of fear and a fragile new shoot of hope warring inside her. She had spent her life learning that no one would ever stand for her. To have this quiet, solitary man stand not in front of her as a master, but beside her as an equal, was a concept so foreign she could barely grasp it. She called the children inside, barred the door, and began to wait. Every snap of a twig in the forest, every gust of wind, sounded like the footsteps of her past, coming to reclaim her. Elias walked into Stonefall with a heavy, deliberate tread. The town was small, a collection of sturdy wooden buildings huddled around a muddy central square. He saw Valerius immediately. The man was holding court on the porch of the inn, a tankard of ale in his hand, speaking to a small group of townsmen. He was dressed in fine, dark wool, his boots polished to a high shine. He gestured with his hands as he spoke, his voice carrying across the square, full of false bonhomie and practiced concern. "A simple creature, you understand," Valerius was saying, and the men around him nodded sagely. "Prone to flights of fancy, I am merely her guardian, responsible for her welfare. The poor thing has gotten herself lost, and I am deeply concerned for her and the children." Elias's jaw tightened. He ignored the group and went directly to the elder's house, a squat, solid building next to the town hall. Mistress Albright was in her garden tending to her cabbages. She was a woman in her 60s, with iron-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun and hands caked with dirt. She looked up as he approached, her eyes sharp and appraising. "Elias," she said, her voice brisk. "You were just here this morning. Forget something?" "No, Mistress Albright," he said, stopping at the edge of her garden. "I came to speak to you about the newcomer, Warden Valerius." She straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron. "I, the fancy man from the south, making a lot of noise about his lost ward, says she's an orc." She squinted at him. "You live out in the woods. You wouldn't have seen an orc woman with 2 children, would you?" Elias met her gaze directly. "She is at my cabin. She has been for more than a month. She is not a ward, and she is not lost. She is a refugee. She is under my protection." Mistress Albright's eyebrows rose. Elias was not a man for gossip or drama. For him to involve himself was significant. "Under your protection? That's a strong statement, woodsman." "She is a hard worker," Elias stated plainly. "My woodpile is stacked for 2 winters. My clothes are mended. My home is clean. She bartered her labor for shelter. It was a fair exchange. He says he has a contract, an indenture of debt. I have seen the scars on her wrists from the chains she broke to escape him," Elias said, his voice dropping low. "A contract does not grant a man the right to use chains." A long silence stretched between them. Mistress Albright studied his face, weighing his words. Elias's reputation in Stonefall was simple. He was honest to a fault, and he kept to himself. He was not a man to lie or exaggerate. "He's demanded a hearing before the town council," she said finally. "Tomorrow morning, to present his claim. He expects us to hand her over." "She will be there," Elias said, "and I will stand with her." "See that you do," Mistress Albright said, turning back to her cabbages. "And tell her to wash her face. Appearances matter in these things." It was the most practical advice she could offer, and in its own way a small gesture of alliance. Elias nodded, turned, and began the long walk back to the cabin, the fate of Gauze's future resting on the simple, unadorned truth he carried. The morning of the hearing dawned grey and cold. Gauze had not slept. She had spent the night staring into the dying embers of the fire, her mind a maelstrom of terror. Elias's quiet confidence was a comfort, but the spectre of Valerius was a demon from a past she had thought escaped. She washed her face and her children's faces in the cold creek water, as Mistress Albright had advised. She braided Lynn's hair and tried to tame Cale's unruly mop. She put on the cleanest, most mended tunic she owned. They were small acts of dignity, a flimsy armour against the humiliation she knew was coming. When it was time to go, Elias handed her the small wooden bird he had carved. "For luck," he said. Gauze clutched it in her hand, its polished surface a small, solid anchor in a sea of fear. They walked to Stonefall together, a strange and silent procession. Elias led the way, his stride steady. Gauze followed, with Lynn's small hand in hers, and Cale walking so close beside her, he was practically touching. When they entered the town square, it felt as though every eye was on them. Whispers followed them like a cloud of insects. They saw Valerius waiting on the steps of the town hall. He was smiling, a look of paternalistic concern perfectly arranged on his features. "Ah, there you are, my dear Gora," he said, his voice booming across the square for all to hear. He always mispronounced her name, a small, constant assertion of his power over her. "I was so worried. You see, everyone, she is safe, just a little confused." Gauze flinched at the sound of his voice, a reflexive, conditioned response. Cale moved to stand in front of her, a tiny, defiant shield. Elias simply put a steadying hand on Gauze's shoulder and guided her past Valerius and into the hall. The town hall was a single large room, already crowded with curious townsfolk. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool and unvoiced prejudice. At the front of the room, Mistress Albright sat behind a heavy oak table, flanked by two other council members, a grim-faced blacksmith and a portly merchant. "Warden Valerius," Mistress Albright said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "You have requested this hearing. State your claim." Valerius stepped forward, radiating confidence. He unrolled a scroll of parchment with a flourish. "Elders of Stonefall, esteemed citizens, I am Warden Valerius, a humble landowner from the southern territories. My claim is simple. This orc female, Gora, and her offspring are bound to me by a familial debt contract, legally transferred upon the death of her mate, who worked in my mines. The contract is here, signed and sealed. It stipulates servitude until the debt is repaid." He passed the document to the blacksmith, who examined the seal and nodded. "It appears legal." "I am not a cruel man," Valerius continued, turning to the crowd. "I have provided for her, sheltered her, but she is of a simple nature, prone to wandering. I fear she was lured away from my protection by this man." He gestured dismissively toward Elias. who has taken advantage of her confusion. I ask only that you return my lawful property to my care, so I may see to her safety." His performance was masterful. He was reasonable, concerned, lawful. Gorza felt the weight of the crowd's opinion shifting against her. They saw a respectable human and a feral-looking orc. The conclusion was obvious to them. Mistress Albright looked at Gorza. "Woman, what is your name?" Gorza's throat was dry. She swallowed hard. "My name is Gorza," she said, her voice quiet but clear. The simple act of correcting him was a tiny rebellion. "Gorza," the elder repeated. "You have heard the warden's claim. Do you dispute this contract?" This was the moment. Gorza's mind went blank with panic. All the arguments, the injustices, the years of pain, they felt impossible to articulate. How could she make them understand? She looked at Elias, who stood beside her, his expression unreadable but solid. She felt the wooden bird in her palm. She thought of her children. She did not try to refute the contract. She did not list her many grievances. She simply spoke the truth of one single night. "The contract is real," she said, her voice gaining a little strength. "The debt is real. My servitude was real." She looked not at the council, but at the faces in the crowd, the mothers, the fathers. "But I ask you, does a contract give a man the right to chain a mother in a courtyard all night, in the cold, for singing a lullaby to her sick and crying child?" A stunned silence fell over the room. The question was so simple, so stark, it cut through all of Valerius's legal posturing. Valerius laughed, a short, sharp sound. A ridiculous exaggeration. She was disciplined for disturbing the peace, nothing more. A necessary measure for such a willful creature. Was it necessary to beat her 10-year-old son for trying to bring her a blanket? Gorza's voice rose, edged with a fire no one in the room had expected. Cale, standing beside her, looked down at the four, but his small shoulders were squared. "Lies and fantasy," Valerius boomed, his polished composure beginning to crack. His volume was rising, a sure sign he was losing control. "Is it?" a new voice cut in. It was the town healer, a quiet woman named Elspeth, who had been standing at the back of the room. She stepped forward. "Because when this woman and her children first passed through town over a month ago, seeking directions, I gave her daughter a salve for a fever. And while I was doing so, I saw the marks on the mother's wrists and ankles. They were raw, infected wounds, not from ropes, from iron chains, the kind used for animals." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Every eye turned from the healer to Gorza's wrists, which she had unconsciously kept hidden. Now she held them out. The scars were pale now, but unmistakable. The tide of opinion in the room turned, swift and absolute. It was one thing to enforce a labor contract. It was another to chain a woman for singing to her child. The people of Stonefall were hard, but they were not cruel. They knew the difference. Mistress Albright slammed her hand down on the oak table, The sound echoed like a gunshot. "Enough! Warden Valerius, your contract stipulates food, shelter, and humane treatment in exchange for labor. The testimony of our healer and the evidence of these scars suggest you have failed to provide the latter. In Stonefall, cruelty voids a contract. Your claim is denied." Valerius's face went purple with rage. "This is an outrage. You backwards peasants cannot defy a legal document." "We can, and we have," Mistress Albright said, her voice like flint. "Now take your papers and your guards and get out of our town. You are no longer welcome here." Valerius stood there, sputtering, his mask of civility completely gone, revealing the ugly, sputtering tyrant beneath. The blacksmith rose to his full, intimidating height, his arms crossed over his massive chest. The warden, seeing he had lost not just the hearing, but the entire room, finally seemed to understand. He snatched his parchment from the table, shot Gorza a look of pure venom, and stormed out of the hall, his guards trailing behind him. He did not look back. It was, Gorza thought, the only honest gesture he had ever made. A quiet cheer went up in the room. Neighbours who had whispered about Gorza now nodded at her with respect. The merchant's wife came forward and pressed a small loaf of bread into her hand. The crisis was over. Truth, spoken plainly, had been enough. Gorza looked at Elias, her heart so full she could not speak. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and led her and the children out of the hall and back into the clean, cold air of freedom. The walk back to the cabin was as silent as the one into town, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer heavy with dread, but light with relief. When they arrived, the cabin felt different. It was not a temporary shelter anymore. It was home. Lynn ran inside to play with the corn husk doll. Cale, for the first time, went not to his mother's side, but to Elias's, and began helping him unhitch the mule, the two of them working together in comfortable quiet. Gorza stood on the porch watching them. The weight of years of fear and servitude was lifting from her shoulders, and she felt dizzy with its absence. Elias finished with the mule and came to stand beside her. They looked out at the forest, the trees stark and beautiful against the autumn sky. Inside, they could hear Lynn humming to her doll. It was the same tuneless, happy little song she always hummed. But then, something shifted. Gorza, without thinking, found herself humming along. It was quiet at first, a barely audible breath of a melody. Then, hesitantly, a few words came, in the old tongue, the lullaby. Her voice was rusty, cracked with disuse, but it was there. It was hers again. She stopped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with surprise and wonder. Elias looked at her, and a rare, genuine smile touched his own lips. "It's a good song," he said. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, they sat by the fire as they so often did. Elias got up and went to the mantel. He took down the dusty, star-punched lantern his wife, Ilara, had made. For 3 years it had sat there, a monument to his grief, a light he refused to rekindle. He wiped it clean with a soft cloth. Then he reached into his pocket and took out the little wooden bird he had carved. He set it on the mantel, right next to the lantern. The old grief and the new hope, side by side, neither one erasing the other. He turned to Gorza. His face in the firelight was open and vulnerable. "My wife, Alara, she would have liked you," he said. "She always said this house needed more noise, more life." He paused, searching for the right words, which never came easily to him. "The wood is stacked for winter, the pantry is full, but the cabin, it feels empty when you're not in it." He took a deep breath. "There is room here, Gorza, for you, for the children, if you would have it." It was not a declaration of love, not a passionate plea. It was something quieter and far more profound. It was an offering of space, a place to put down roots. Gorza looked at this quiet, steady man, at the lantern and the bird sitting together on the mantel, at the sleeping forms of her children, safe and warm. She had come to his door with nothing, and he had given her everything that mattered. "Yes," she whispered, the word full of a hope she was no longer afraid to feel. "Yes, Elias, we would have it." They were married a week later, not in a church but in the town hall, with Mistress Albright officiating and the blacksmith and his wife as witnesses. It was a simple ceremony, with no frills, only plain, honest vows spoken in the quiet of the morning. Afterwards, Cale, who had been watching with a solemn expression, walked up to Elias and tugged on his sleeve. He didn't say father. He said, "Can you show me how to track deer?" Elias put his hand on the boy's shoulder and nodded. It was an acceptance, as binding as any vow. That night, back in the cabin, the lantern on the mantel was lit for the first time in 3 years. Its punched tin stars cast a soft, dancing light across the walls, pushing back the shadows. Gorza sat with Lynn in her lap, and as the little girl grew sleepy, Gorza began to sing. The old lullaby, in the old tongue. Her voice was still a little rough, but it was clear and strong, filling the warm, small room with a melody of survival and of peace. The home was finally, completely warm. For a heart doesn't heal by emptying itself of grief, but by growing large enough to hold grief and joy together.